I am here with Dr. Roy Hamilton. He is an assistant professor in neurology and physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Pennsylvania. Also works in the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. How are you doing, Roy? Welcome.
Great.
So, as we were talking about last time, I had Dr. Dave Vago on, who is a researcher at Harvard, and he was invited by the Dalai Lama to teach the Dalai Lama's monks a course in neuroscience. So this was a really interesting talk. During that talk, he held up a device, which was a portable EEG machine, and he said he's going to bring that over for the monks to look at and to play around with, maybe collect some data. And so that got us talking about non-invasive brain stimulation. And the Dalai Lama has a quote where he said that basically if neuroscientists could figure out a way to reduce negative emotion, sign him up. And so we talked about the possibility of monks, maybe in the near future, making use of non-invasive brain stimulation to enhance their meditation or just what they might think of it. So we'll talk to him again and have some conversations with the monks. But as you're a world expert in non-invasive brain stimulation, I thought it'd be great to have you on to talk about what this technology is. So when people say non-invasive brain stimulation, what do they usually mean when they say that?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your very kind introductions. When we talk about non-invasive brain stimulation, we are talking about modulating the function of brain areas in a focal manner, generally using one of two kinds of technologies, either electrical stimulation of some type or magnetic stimulation. So if you'll allow me, I'd like to briefly talk about what each of those things is. And I'll start with magnetic stimulation. So for transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, the underlying principle is that you're taking an electromagnet. It is an electromagnet, so it's inert, so basically a winding of wire, and then passing a large current through it in a very short period of time. That would be a pulse of TMS. So when you have that winding, you pass the pulse through it. What happens is that in that moment, when current is passing through it, that creates a fluxing electromagnetic field, right? A fluxing magnetic field. And we know, actually, we've known for a long time, Michael Faraday in the 19th century actually discovered that when you pass current through an electromagnet, if you have a second conductive body, right, for example, another wire, and it is near that first one, within the range of the fluxing magnetic field. As that magnetic field is created, as it goes from nothing to full strength back to nothing, in that time, current will actually be generated in the nearby conductive body, even if those bodies were not touching.
Okay.
So this is the principle of electromagnetic induction at a distance. And that is the underlying idea behind TMS. In this case, we have an electromagnet, and the second conductive body, if you will, is the cells of the brain. So we are able to generate current in the cells of the brain at a distance from the magnet. So even though the magnet itself isn't touching those cells, right? It's non-invasive. It's outside your skull. It's outside your scalp. It's outside your hair. It's still able to generate current in the brain cells underneath in a very focal manner. Right? And so that causes them to fire, and once we can cause brain cells to fire in different patterns, we can cause different kinds of predictable effects in brain physiology and, as I'm sure we'll discuss, in behavior. So that's one.
So it's great. So thank you. That was an excellent, concise description. So I just want to add my memories of learning to use this device in your lab. Just to sort of set the stage, it basically looks something like a hairdryer to put it very simplistically, attached to a large machine that looks
1980 VCR looking thing.
Right, exactly. And so this device pulses a magnetic wave into the brain, and would it be correct to say it directly causes action potentials in
Yes.
okay.
So it generates sufficient current in neurons to stimulate action potentials.
In about a square millimeter of patch of cortex. Is that right? About the spatial resolution?
I mean, it sort of depends on it. That actually depends a lot on the dimensions of the coil you're using. But we like to say, centimeter and a half by centimeter and a half,
Okay.
An area about the size of your thumbnail.
Okay.
That's the brain.
So when in learning how to use this device in your lab, the sort of the final test, so to speak, was to find the area of the motor strip that controls the arm, and to get, in this case, Olu's arm to raise slightly involuntarily.
Yeah.
So just to give listeners a appreciation for the scale of what this is capable of. So you're able to slightly lift someone's arm involuntarily simply by pulsing a magnetic field into a patch of cortex on the brain.
That's right. So what we're doing there is we're testing your ability to find the right area when we're training you by having you look for the brain's representation of your arm, right? What we call the motor cortex, and on that motor cortex, the portion that represents your arm and your hand. And the reason we do that is because we need some kind of immediate readout, right? Just to know that you hit the right area. So we have you target that region, and then if the hand moves, then we know that you targeted the hand area, that you could find it. And so that's useful because it gives us an immediate physiology to physical world readout, right? So that's why we have you learn that. Yeah.
Great. So that was TMS, and you mentioned electrical stimulation. So this is TDCS.
Right. So let's move TMS to the side a little bit, and we'll talk about different kinds of, there are different kinds of electrical stimulation. We're going to focus on one, the most commonly referred to, most commonly referenced these days type, which is called transcranial direct current stimulation. All right. And so if the principle underlying TMS, what we just talked about, if that's pretty straightforward, all that electromagnetic induction at distance, then the idea underlying TDCS is even simpler. I mean, the basic core idea is that you take two or more electrodes. I say two or more because there has to be some combination of anode and cathode. So in other words, if you imagine it, the plus and minus ends, right? And there have to be some of each of those, so at least one, and you place them on the scalp. And then you run current between them. And the current will run through the tissues that are interposed between the electrodes that you've placed on the scalp. Now, it's not a lot of current, same order of magnitude as what might come out of a 9-volt battery, but that very low amount of current running between your anode and your cathode, that is sufficient once it gets attenuated somewhat by your scalp and the skull and all the tissues in between. It's still sufficient to cause incremental shifts, tiny little shifts in the membrane resting potentials of neurons. And this is mechanistically importantly different from what we just discussed with TMS. Right? TMS is sufficient to cause brain cells to fire right then and there. Right? TDCS causes tiny little shifts in resting membrane potentials, not enough to cause them to fire right then and there, but over time, since brain cells generally, their resting state is sort of close to the state where they would fire. They sort of hover in that zone. To move them just a little bit over time, that actually makes a significant difference in how often and how likely they are to fire. Right, so you can affect the physiologic behavior of these cells over time with TDCS in this way.
And you can make them less likely or more likely to fire.
Exactly what I was about to say. You can make them either more likely or less likely to fire.
Great.
Another important difference between the two technologies, we talked a little bit about how focal TMS is. Generally speaking, conventional TDCS, and by conventional I mean one anode, one cathode placed on the head with current run between them. It's not a very focal, high-resolution technology. You're basically almost bathing a large swath of brain in between those two electrodes in a very small amount of current. But nonetheless, over a period of time, you can change cortical activity and with appreciable, measurable changes in behavior.
Great, thanks. So we had TMS, which is magnetic, TDCS, which is electric. Now, in talking to Dave Vago afterwards, Dr. Matt Keener, a psychiatrist, got in touch with me, and he knows these people at Think, and so Think is a non-invasive brain stimulation company, and they sent a couple of these devices to Dave Vago to bring to India to play with and to show these monks. Now, Think is a little bit different, I understand, than TDCS, although it operates under similar principles. So could you distinguish those two technologies, whatever Think is using, and TDCS?
Sure. So I think the main difference in terms of the putative mechanism is that the creators of Think argue that what their device does, and I don't really have sufficient experience with the device specifically to have an opinion about their opinion about the mechanism.
Me neither.
So, with that caveat, what they argue is that the main mechanism by which the device has its effects are actually indirect, aimed at stimulating cranial nerves. So just a second to talk a little bit about neuroanatomy. Right?
Sure.
So the cranial nerves are the nerves that come out of your, for the most part, out of your brainstem and supply innervation to the various functions, the vast majority of those functions being related to things from the neck up. So, for example, the nerves that innervate your ability to move your eyes or the reflexes of your pupils or your ability to move your face or have sensation or your tongue or lift your palate, all these things are mediated by what are called cranial nerves. They also have an important role in some autonomic functions. And so, as you can imagine, insofar as the cranial nerves supply all the movement and sensation from all over your head, you can access them. There's cranial nerve innervation basically everywhere, right up here. And what they're doing is they're stimulating areas that they think are actually affecting cranial nerves. And then by virtue of affecting cranial nerve function or cranial nerve physiology, that provides a route back into the brain. And we know actually that cranial nerve innervation in the brainstem touches lots of other areas and has lots of other sort of downstream innervation. So you can actually affect brain function in more global ways. At least that's their argument, by affecting this afferent, the nerve information as it comes in from those cranial nerves, right? So they're manipulating from the outside, but they're taking a biological highway, if you will, into the brain.
And is that biological highway having to do with the vagal tone and parasympathetic versus sympathetic modulation?
It could. I'm not totally clear on which cranial nerves they believe they are primarily influencing, and depending on which they are, that could have differential effects on sympathetic and parasympathetic function.
Okay. Well, thank you for those very concise, very useful characterizations of those technologies. Now, when I first learned about these technologies, and I imagine a lot of people have this similar response, you're talking about modulating areas of the brain, making neurons fire or more or less likely to fire. It sounds like this would be a very risky intervention. It turns out that they're all surprisingly safe. But can you talk a little bit to their safety?
Sure. So again, I'm going to start with TMS, then I'll move to TDCS. I'm going to stick to those two modalities since that's really what we do in my laboratory. So for TMS, there are known risks. There is one risk that is especially one that we're concerned about, or one that doesn't happen often, but we take pains to make sure that we are in a parameter space to make sure that it doesn't happen, and that is the induction of seizure. Right? So you can imagine, just to back up over this concept, so if a seizure is a runaway, uncontrolled transmission of activity in the brain, right? You can imagine that you've got this technology. The technology introduces sufficient energy into the brain to actually cause it to fire right then and there. You can imagine if that was done in a thoughtless, careless, or irresponsible manner, that could then sort of prompt the brain to go on and fire more and uncontrollably on its own, thus inducing a seizure. And in fact, there are some cases of seizure induction with TMS. However, we have established fairly rigorous parameters with respect to the intensity, the frequency, and the duration of stimulation that healthy brains can undergo, or that they should undergo. And within those parameters, the technology is very safe. So I just mentioned that.
Can you put a number on that? I remember in the training, there was a figure that was thrown around about how likely it is that TMS would induce the seizure.
I mean, we're talking about, a handful, sort of in the mid-teens of documented cases of induced seizures ever in the so thousands of, tens of thousands of people who've been stimulated. I imagine many more now that TMS has been approved, FDA approved, for the treatment of depression. So really, we're talking about a pretty infinitesimally small likelihood of an adverse event with this technology. It just happens to be the case that it's the one thing that we know that if we were especially careless, we could do.
Right. So this is an exceedingly, and to my mind, surprisingly safe technology. I mean, the adverse effects seem to be, as you say, minuscule. Yes. At least in terms of seizures.
Yes. So, I don't mean to. There is a tendency for people to conflate the severity of a risk with the frequency of a risk. Nobody wants to have a seizure, obviously, but the likelihood of it happening is very, very small.
Okay, and you talk about this in a New York Times interview, I think, and we can post that below this video so people can dive into some more detail.
Great.
So that would be great. So and then you mentioned you were going to talk about TDCS.
Yep. Yes. So the story is even easier to discuss with TDCS. So to our knowledge, there have been no serious adverse effects of TDCS documented in any study across thousands of sessions, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of individuals who've been stimulated. So that is not to say that it is not possible to have adverse events. I always say that treatments can have whatever side effects they want to have, but we have not found any serious ones to be concerned about yet with this technology. Now, there are possible effects from administering the technology in ways that are incorrect or careless. So, for example, it is possible if the technology is administered incorrectly to induce a scalp burn, burn through the skin, since you're running current through the skin.
Sure,
However, when properly administered, we have not yet demonstrated any serious adverse health outcomes.
And people are making these TDCS devices on their own in their basements, and so I'm imagining that this is the kind of context that makes these kinds of risks much more likely to occur.
Yeah, that is one thing that is a potential concern, is that it's the low barrier to entry with TDCS in particular, and it's the kind of technology that is, we believe it's safe, so that's not a particular barrier to entry. It is inexpensive. I mean, compared to having a TMS device, a TDCS device is both inexpensive and technically not that complicated. So those very low barriers to entry have predispose themselves to the creation of a community of individuals who are stimulating themselves either for self-therapeutic reasons or for the potential for cognitive enhancement. And while I think that a number of them are quite erudite in learning about the technologies, there's no way to actually guarantee the quality and safety of either the practices or the products. So it is a potential concern that they might do things like burn themselves.
Right. And Rachel, a postdoc in your lab, has written an open letter about this issue. So hopefully once that comes out, we can post that as well, and interested people can look into that a bit more. So non-invasive brain stimulation technology is a great boon to cognitive neuroscience research. Early on, I know that they referred to this as a virtual lesion. So kind of demonstrating or tying this capability into a decades-old or longer tradition of examining what happens to behavior and other mental processes when there's a lesion on an area of the brain, which is essentially damage to some area of the brain. And the idea was that these devices could replicate that temporarily. And so researchers would have a much better opportunity to study these effects. Now, I understand that isn't really used, that characterization of a virtual lesion, because, of course, you can enhance or disenhance. In other words, you can activate or inhibit different areas of the brain. So what kinds of findings really are classic findings from these technologies? What kinds of mental processes, what kind of behaviors are you able to modulate using non-invasive brain stimulation?
Well, there's really a variety. I mean, I'm not sure I would pick out any that are specifically emblematic of the potential of the technologies.
Okay.
I think that you did hit the nail on the head with respect to there being similarities and differences between what these technologies are capable of and what has historically been referred to as a virtual lesion. Mm-hmm. I think that terminology had some attractiveness some time ago because we could induce a gap or a temporary deficit in function, and that in cognitive neuroscience would have implications for the structure-function relationship of some region. If knocking out or temporarily manipulating the function of that region results in a change in a behavior, then that tells you or gives you strong evidence that that region is somehow responsible for the behavior. So that's where that virtual lesion idea came from and was popularized. Mm-hmm. However, you can't induce a gain of function with lesion studies, and I think you correctly intimate that there's a gain of function that is possible with certain neuromodulation techniques, and I think that's been one of the things that's made TDCS relatively attractive. In addition to its low barrier to entry, that there are a variety of studies where you can demonstrate in cognitive neuroscience not only that manipulating function in a downward direction, but also in an upward direction with respect to the behavior. Both of those are powerful tools for implicating a structure-function relationship, between a region of the brain or a network in the brain and some cognitive operation, right? And so that's been attractive. I will say that as far as TDCS is concerned, a particular area, I think, if I had to choose one area where it's been demonstrated especially convincingly, I would say certain types of procedural learning. Although
interesting.
That's not the only area, but there have been some very good papers in which individuals can show that as you're acquiring some skill, that the act of combining TDCS with the learning of some skill can lead to sustained gains over time, the performance of that skill.
And so this has been done in language acquisition studies. I've seen quantitative skills learning. Both of these forms of learning are able to be enhanced by non-invasive brain stimulation.
Yeah.
So if someone's out there studying for their SAT or their GRE, should they be stopping by your laboratory for a booster of verbal and quantitative learning abilities?
Well, that's an interesting question, and because it raises the question of what actually, what can we do in terms of cognitive enhancement with these technologies? I mean, certainly we've been able to demonstrate in a variety of domains. I didn't run through a litany, but I could briefly. I mean, there are studies in executive function, language, visual spatial processing, attention. I mean, you can go through mathematical reasoning as you
creativity, which Sharon Thompson
we're working on that. Yeah.
Demonstrating
that you can at least temporarily manipulate and enhance some of these abilities if you have some strong idea of what the neural substrate is. However, there are some potential reasons to think that we need to know more about these technologies before we go all in and think that we're just going to stimulate all types of cognitive operations.
Good. Yeah, I'm interested in that.
David, there is some imperative knocking at my door.
Yeah, feel free. I'll mention some of the other studies that have been done. Okay. So as Roy answers the door, I think two really interestingly abstract findings or mental processes that are able to be influenced by brain stimulation are creativity on the one hand and morality on the other. And part of why I think these are so interesting is that there's no clear spot or very clear substrate for either creativity or morality, although we know a lot about the networks at work. So are you good, Roy? Can we continue, or should we?
I think if we could wrap up.
Wrap up, yeah.
Not necessarily immediately, but in the next few minutes, that would be great.
Okay. So there's a fascinating litany of very abstract to very physical, mental, and physical processes that can be influenced by non-invasive brain stimulation technology. You're just starting to talk about how maybe before people get too excited about enhancement, they should hold on a minute because there are some other things to consider before we just go ahead and try to enhance a particular mental process.
Yeah. So I think there are a number of issues to consider. I'm only going to go over a subset of them, and I'm going to focus primarily on a type of safety issue, but a different type of safety issue than I think the literature has focused on with respect to TDCS and TMS. I'm not talking about seizures. I'm not talking about burns. I'm not talking about any of these sort of very physical types of harm. What I'm talking about is the possibility of inadvertently influencing cognitive function in ways that are unintended, right? And so let me give you some examples. So it seems somewhat oversimplified. I think it takes only a moment's worth of reflection to realize or to think that if you modulate the function of some region in some monolithic way, in other words, all the neurons in some area are going to be a little bit closer to depolarization or a little bit farther from depolarization, that is going to have a universal enhancing effect on some cognitive operation.
Good.
Right? Brain function is an incredibly delicately balanced thing. It is circuits modulating networks, modulating other circuits in positive forward and backward feedback loops, right? So it is on some level an oversimplification to think that, if everything is a little bit enhanced, that means every function is going to be enhanced. So let me give you some examples to give you a little bit of pause about that. So I didn't get to talk about some of our work, but two experiments that we've done recently were one involving working memory, the ability to hold and manipulate information online in your mind. And for that, we applied a type of stimulation that we believe had, if anything, according to canonical ways of thinking about TDCS, more excitatory rather than inhibitory effects.
Okay.
Another body of work, which you touched on, I heard you touching on it while I was out, but is to manipulate creativity.
Right, and we're working on this right now.
And the approach, the theoretical approach, is to actually create a little bit of inhibition, right? A little bit of sort of down-regulation of regions of the frontal lobe that we think are responsible for highly structured thinking, and so that will sort of relax your the structure that you're imposing, and allow for people to think more flexibly about alternative uses for common objects. Fine. But the thing is, for these two experiments, we are trying to do opposite things to the same area of brain. Okay? So what's the implication there? So what is it? What will happen if we were to test working memory in the people who were trying to influence creativity, or creativity in the individuals for whom we were trying to enhance working memory? Right? That it gives one pause to think that we're imposing monolithic directional effects on brain areas, even though the brain is balanced, and you might get differential effects and different cognitive abilities via that stimulation.
So this is the point. This is the moment to make the point, the obligatory point. The brain is incredibly complicated and involves many recursive loops and systems and feedback, and so just knocking out or activating or turning down one area is going to have a lot of effects that we don't know about. So in other words, you've got your work cut out for you. We've got our work cut out for us in terms of this field is much needs to be done in terms of basic research, tying these mental processes and brain functions together. So I know we have to wrap up, but I wanted to touch on one thing that you brought up in your great paper, Rethinking the Thinking Cap, which we'll also post, where I think it was in that paper, where you mentioned the possibility, and this is the sort of moonshot, what may come from this technology down the line, of unlocking savant-like abilities. Do you mind saying a few words about that?
Well, I think that my opinions about that perhaps have been a little bit over portrayed. I know that there are some researchers who have really locked onto this idea of the ability to unlock your nascent potential by, in particular, it sort of relates somewhat tangentially to what we were talking about, releasing areas of the brain from top-down control, right? And that can be done effectively. That might release some hidden potentials. And I think that whereas some elements of that theory, that general theory, can be applied to some of what we were talking about creativity, I think you have to be very cautious about the possibility of, as we just said, I think that the caveat we made before, that the brain's incredibly complicated and that manipulating things in one direction is going to have the possibility of unintentional effect. I think that applies to any thinking that we might have about enhanced savant abilities. Is it the case that this is necessarily an all gain situation? The degree of complexity of the system itself suggests that may not be the case. So while I think that it is possible, for us to use these technologies to enhance our cognition, and I don't know what the limits of that are, as I don't think anyone knows what the limits of that are. I think that it may not be it may not be necessarily fruitful for us to think that the immediate effect, the thing that we're going to see, is Einstein's, Mozart's, and Picasso's right away. Possibly some significant trade-offs.
Great. Well, we'll leave it there on that tantalizing possibility.
Can I ask one ethical question to to the monks and to the person who's going out to talk to them?
Yes,
So can I leave you with a question and a thought? So one of
please.
the ethical concerns that I've raised a couple of times with respect to brain stimulation is if we're able to manipulate cognition and make acts of cognition and emotional states easier, what does that do to society in a broader way when the ability to achieve things mentally and emotionally gets easier? And it seems to me like that's a question that there's this moray of value that we have that's sort of built into our social DNA, the value of struggle, right? That which does not kill me makes me stronger, kind of idea that it's the struggle is part of the worth of doing things. So what does it mean for things, including contemplative states or peaceful states of mind, just to get easier for everyone?
Yeah, so if you have a monk, you have a room filled with monks using brain stimulation devices to enhance meditation,
Yeah.
maybe it's more bliss, less self-regulation,
Right.
as a result, because they're not working for it in the same way.
Yeah.
And it's a larger point. There's at Johns Hopkins, there's psilocybin research being done on sort of self-transcendent or spiritual states of mind. And a lot of people say, well, look, in a lot of traditions, you have to meditate for many years in order to have one of these experiences. If you just get it for free, does it have the same kind of staying power or potentially
Right.
transformative effects?
Yeah.
So that's really fascinating. Maybe when Dave Vago calls us from India with a Buddhist monk playing with this brain stimulation device, we can have you either call in or I can convey that message,
Great.
and we'll have that conversation.
That's my question for you for the Dalai Lama. Is the road still as worth traveling if it's much, much easier to get there?
Very nice. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Roy, and I'll be in touch with you about Dave and the Dalai Lama's response.
Okay, great.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.